Welcome back. More than 75 years ago, Mexico nationalized its oil industry, something that has made most Mexicans very proud. It has been run by the government ever since. But in recent years, Pemex, the state-owned oil company, has struggled with declining production and a lack of money to update its operations. President Enrique Pena Nieto vowed to reform the energy sector by allowing outsiders in. Last year, his government passed the reform and is now, for the first time, opening Mexico's energy industry to private companies. Contracts and licenses will be offered to those who offer the best return. Those investors must pay royalties and taxes to the Mexican government for the right to explore and drill. Our political analyst Laura Carlsen joins us now from Mexico City with more on these moves. You know, there's been a lot of speculation that Pemex really needed some outside investment because it was broke. Is that true?
Well, no, that can't really be true. Pemex makes tens of billions of dollars a year in income from exploiting Mexico's considerable oil supplies. But there were two fundamental flaws, and one was that Pemex was being overtaxed. The federal government was using Pemex as its cash cow. They were basically taking off about 79% of its earnings to fund other programs in the federal government. And this is related to a second problem, which is that there wasn't sufficient reinvestment in Pemex. So we were looking at old oil fields and lack of investment in new refineries, which meant that Pemex was having to import refined oil where you make more money. So they were facing a number of structural flaws, but most of those flaws were a result of government mismanagement in the first place.
You know, just before this reform passed, we had a chance to sit down with President Pena Nieto and ask him directly about that. And I'd like you to take a listen to it and get your reaction afterward. Would you say that Mexico and Pemex have enough to attract foreign investment?
Pemex does not have the resources that are needed to exploit our sources of energy, and I believe that the private sector could be instrumental in exploiting the resources we have. I'll give you an example. In the United States in the last few years, more than 9,000 wells have been drilled for shale gas exploitation. Pemex could only work on 3. We know that our reserves are quite large. This energy is abundant in our country, therefore we need to exploit these resources the way they should be. Now,
Laura, you heard his answer. Do you think Mexico can attract the foreign investment that it needs?
Well, first of all, it's interesting to note that he did not answer the question. He discussed how Pemex needs foreign investment and how this could possibly be a solution to some of the financial problems it faces. However, attracting foreign investment is going to be much more difficult, and I think that's why he didn't specifically address it. For one thing, we probably thought we'd never say this, but there could be a problem with demand. We're looking at a boom in the United States and Canada in oil production due to the shale oil production development that's taking place there at a really rapid rate. In fact, Joe Biden, the vice president in the Caribbean recently, said that he was looking in the relatively near term to a United States that was self-sufficient in oil and gas. This means that the major market for Mexico could be reducing at a very rapid rate, and it's not clear that they're going to have a lot of opportunities for expanding or diversifying that market.
And Laura, I want you to go back to the issue of corruption, because that's been to blame for a lot of Pemex's problems. And with this new reform, it calls for public bids to grant new licenses, but Pemex will get the first shot at getting a license. So do you think that could bring about more transparency in this whole process?
That's right, Elaine, and they have tried to address corruption within these reforms, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough, and there's still some really serious issues that are there. For one thing, transparency is key, and that means citizen oversight as well as government oversight, but it's also not enough, because even if you have the information, if there aren't mechanisms to control that and to have sanctions and that type of thing, then they don't do a whole lot of good. And there are some here, but there probably are not enough. And then I think what's really central to this issue of corruption, because nobody denies that Pemex was being bled by corruption from the union to the federal government and everywhere in between. But there's been this government argument that somehow privatization cures corruption. And we know that that's not true. We know it from history and from the way transnational oil companies have operated in other countries. So the idea that this is somehow going to be the end of corruption or be a major step forward, there are many, many people, myself included as an analyst, who are skeptical about that and feel that the mechanisms that are being put in place, supposedly will be put in place under this reform, are insufficient to do this.
Laura, we only have a short time left, but how long before we see any real change with Pemex? I know this is still in the beginning stages of opening up, but could we see any sort of positive change sooner than later?
Even the government's being very cautious about that one. They're saying it will be 2 years before we see one of the most important changes to consumers, which is a reduction in prices of gas, oil, gasoline, and electricity, which is also included in the reforms. They are not predicting anything major. They say that there will be a 1% increase in the growth rate by 2018, but they're being cautious on purpose, because not only is this a long-term process of getting all these new institutions and mechanisms in place, but it's also not likely to go even as fast as they'd hoped, precisely because of the relative lack of outside interest.
All right, Laura Carlsen, as always, we appreciate your time and perspective. Thank you again for joining us from Mexico City.
Coming up.
Fighting crime with sports in Brazil.
Now, I get a real buzz out of seeing a young person be all they can be themselves. They've done it for themselves. All we've done is open a door and help them through that door.
America's Next.